Muchas gracias, Belén. Y muchas gracias por esta oportunidad de contar una historia de un proyecto colaborativo entre la Universidad de Vigo y la Universidad de Wollongong. Y gracias también por lo inestimable apoyo do Campus do Mar. Escoitade. Listen. Do you recognize these sounds? Yes, birds. What are these birds? Where are they? What are their coordinates? If you are a keen and scientifically informed bird watcher, you might identify the bird calls, then speculate on their location. But while birds have a natural habitat, they also migrate, depending on the season. So these birds can be anywhere. Their location is difficult to ascertain. The only thing that's certain is that during the time of recording, these birds are in a particular roost. These trees, this land, this air. Well, there are actually two sets of birds in this recording. The first birds that you heard with the tiny, tiny bird calls are from Vigo, recorded in the Castro last year. And through sound editing, I connected their bird calls with another recording made last month of birds in Wollongong, Australia, where I live. So Vigo and Wollongong, both regional, coastal, and multicultural cities, are the main players in the Transnational Story-making project that I will be discussing today. And sound is a key medium in this collaborative story-making within these individual cities and between them, thus connecting two very different cultures that have some resonances across two continents and two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. Okay, now Vigo would be somewhere there, yeah? Vigo, latitude 43 degrees, 16 seconds north, longitude 8 degrees, 19 seconds west. And Wollongong is around here, around there. So Wollongong, latitude 34 degrees, 26 seconds and south, and longitude 150 degrees, 53 seconds east. Given their coordinates, we can be certain and exact about the location of our respective cities. But that sound recording of birds defies our certainty, our exact sense of place, at least in our ears at first hearing. And birds, as we know, literally defy definite locations, definite latitudes and longitudes as they fly, roost, cross oceans and migrate, and roost again in other locations. They constantly renegotiate their coordinates, as human beings do. In these contemporary times when travel, including transnational travel, both actual and imaginary, has become commonplace, even if our consciousness or imaginary is somehow rooted in a particular culture. Or should we say, roosted in a particular culture? because with global and local flux, our cultural roots are often a tenuous roost. The self can very easily leave or lose this cultural roost, and even the original makeup of this roost keeps changing with, as Belen said, globalization. Our self, its roots or roost, its home, is constantly interacting with many other variables, other selves, cultures, homes, events, etc., that are different to us. So, we could wake up one day and realize, pero yo ya no soy yo, ni mi casa es ya mi casa. But I am no longer I, nor is my house now my house. These quotes, which some of you, do you recognize it? From that famous poem of Federico Garcia Lorca, my favorite, Romancero Sonambulo, of course recontextualized in this lecture, can be a scary reality, and as we know in that poem, it is a scary reality. Or, taken out of context now in this and put in this lecture, it could be a liberating suggestion of potentiality. In this shifting house, where I am no longer I, perhaps we can dream of latitude. Dream of latitude. This sounds like a perplexing proposition because we understand the word latitude as a measurement of location and navigation, which means the angular distance north or south of the Earth's equator, measured in degrees along a meridian, as on a map or a globe. When we quote the latitude of a place in the map, we have an exact location. We know exactly where our house or city is. But I am more interested in the other definition of latitude, which is the freedom from narrowness. Imagine this. In this house where yo ya no soy yo, ni mi casa es ya mi casa, the house or the consciousness has latitude. It is expansive enough to accommodate even those who are different to us. It is enough room for both the self and the other in intersubjective play. And in the constant negotiation between the self and the other, perhaps, just perhaps, we can discover ways of relating that assist our sustainable coexistence in this shared space. I imagine we can all relate to this idea of a shifting house, with Vigo being a global port and Wollongong a multicultural city of around 90 different nationalities as a result of migration. Moreover, both cities are coastal and regional. Okay, let's have a look at them. Of course, you know this. I took this photo on my first time here. So, Vigo, Galicia region, Pontevedra province, Spain, and Wollongong is here. Have a look. Wollongong, Illawarra region, New South Wales, state of New South Wales, Australia. See? Do you see the similarity? Different colors, though. That's what I notice about Vigo. It's just a different color to, you know, I think it's the light. Anyway, look, both our cities are at the intersection. Let me just try that so we can see that. Both our cities are at the intersection of terra firma y mar, between a geographically fixed land and a fluid expanse of ocean, the Atlantic for Vigo and the Pacific for Wollongong. We are at the juncture of departures and arrivals. So psychologically, perhaps, this is a little theory. Psychologically, perhaps our sense of border is not absolutely fixed. We have a coastal sensibility or imaginary. In this case, the self is always at the edge of voyaging out of itself towards other territories and similarly receiving others from different territories. In 2009, and some of you will, of course, who are members of the TSH, know this, the pilot one, Associate Professor Belen Martin Lucas and I experimented with how the self voyages out of itself to another territory and receives others from a different territory. How do both self and other connect across a vast distance of land and water and different time zones? To answer this question, we conducted the Transnational Story Hub, which was the story-making pilot experiment for the research project that I am discussing today. Now, in this story-making hub, facilitated through a website, my creative writing students at the University of Wollongong wrote stories together with Belen's literature students here at the University of Vigo. The process went like this. A Wollongong student wrote a very short story of 200 words, and a Vigo student picked up a word or a concept from the Wollongong story and used it to write another 200 words of story, which was also continued by another student from the other city, and so on. And the story-making collaboration progressed for a whole semester. I would like to show you an excerpt from the outcomes of that story-making experiment. In this excerpt, you have stories from 3 different writers. Now let's see if you can tell which story comes from what city. Okay. Okay, just a context before I just keep scrolling. Can you read it from there? That far, or should I make it bigger? Is it okay? It's readable. Yeah, good. So just a bit of background first. We began the pilot story making with text from my own novel, Fish Hair Woman, which was a work in progress then, and to be published next year. That's the starting point. This excerpt text is a proposition about the generous space of the heart, like a house that is expansive. It has latitude. Let's read that. How much can the heart accommodate? Only 4 chambers, but with infinite space, like memory, where there is room, even for those whom we do not love. ¿Cuánto puede albergar el corazón? Solo 4 cámaras, pero con el espacio infinito, como la memoria, donde hay espacio incluso para aquellos a los que no aman. Is it correct? Well, I went to the internet too. So I thought, I hope it's all right. It's beautiful in Spanish. Okay, so from this quoted text, the following stories grew from 3 students. Let's look at the first story. I gazed out the window as the lesson began. Today we examine the human heart. First, I want you to take that heart and with 2 fingers press down on the letters E and A. Be firm. Observe how the heart becomes hurt. I followed and felt the pain. Next, release your fingers and allow the heart to return to its natural state. Now take your scalpel and make an incision along both sides of the R. Take that R and place it in the stainless steel ball. Then we suture the A and the T and see how we produce heat. Notice where all the heat lies in the heart. You may replace your R now. I felt dizzy. Again, with a clean scalpel, make a cut after the E and place the he in the ball. See, we end up with art, a major component of the heart. This is a large heart. Let's trim the last letter T so that we have the word here. By trimming the first letter H, we end up with ear. A resemblance? No. I wanted to shout. Why have these many lives come to us? My memory was hushed. Okay, the TSH team will not be part of it, but from where do you think is this story? Is it from Vigo or from Wollongong, the writer? Any guess? With that kind of story? Okay, I might as well tell you. It was written by one of my creative writing students in Wollongong, Patrick McGowan. It is an inventive surgery of the heart, right? From where we can extricate other words, hurt, heat, and art. And one, isn't it great? One can even grow another organ, the ear. This little story is a metaphor for the potentiality of the heart equated with the potentiality of language, that both have space for others different to the heart's or the word's original meaning, reality, or capacity. And as the storyteller writes, it is a large heart, and many lives come to us through it. Well, doesn't this give us hope? Now let's proceed to the response of the next story maker who picked up, okay, let me just go down. The next story maker, as you can see, picked up the word hurt, so that was marked in red, and used that word to run with his or her, I won't tell you, 200-word short story. Let's have a look at that. Heart heat hurts humans, shouted the newspaper headline. While waiting for my desirable plane home, I approached the stand and read it again. Heart heat hurts humans. The alliteration and the strength of the message astounded me and made my mind repeat the caption again and again. Why the warmth of one's heart can do harm to others? Shouldn't it be the other way around, that we people are those who create long life scars on hearts? The flow of my contemplation was suddenly stopped when the last call for my flight was announced. I went running to the gate in order not to miss the plane I've been waiting for so long. Even though I was greeted in my mother tongue by the flight attendant, which usually makes me switch into my native language, I kept on deliberating on the English paper title. I felt really uncomfortable with the juxtaposition of heart and hurt. But as soon as I passed through the arrivals door at my destination airport, everything became crystal clear. I saw my mother, smiling yet with huge tears running down her rosy cheeks. I dashed towards her and gave her a strong hug. I could hear her heart beating fast, marking the intervals of happiness and pain at the same time. From where is this story? Do you think? It is, we have the writer here. It's from Vigo, written by Dominika Lewandowska, well, a transnational, originally from Poland and now living, found her heart, a new heart here in Galicia. Okay, this is a story of homecoming, which begins with a foreign heart in an English newspaper using heart in a context that perplexes the traveler, waiting for the plane that she's been waiting for so long. And the story ends with a heart beating in its native tongue because the traveler has come home to her mother's arms, her mother's heart. This story encapsulates the tension between different languages and sensibilities, in fact, different hearts, so to speak. Such is the reality of the negotiation of different cultures. Collision comes first, before you can even dream up collaboration. The intersubjective play between self and other is a collision collaboration of differences and connectivities. Well, let us not forget the connectivities, the human resonances in this age when we are so obsessed with difference, an attitude that has created so much conflict and war. Now let's move on to the third story, which used the phrase flight, as you can see in red there, from the previous story, and then went on to write the next story. Viaja al corazón del Caribe. A long flight and my readings already completed, the only thought to entertain my mind was that tourist leaflet slogan enticing potential honeymooners and holiday makers to go deep this land. Non-stop trip to the guts of the Caribbean, paradise for tourists for only 390 euros, tasas no incluidas. But my heart was no longer there. On arriving to Las Americas, all seemed to be pieced together. She was some paradise else, further up north in a more concrete jungle, pumping for her own dearest ones, until the day she makes sure we all can pay for that thrill into the exuberant land the leaflet reads, the land she calls her home, our home. I am stepping out of the airport. Heat and moist instantly give their welcome. A man ignores the woman shouting, "Cuánto hasta San Cristobal?" He beckons me over as he says some English words in case I need a taxi. I smile, for I am again recognized as something else, even when the Caribbean can still be read on my own skin and heart, or so I've been told. I am only offered a tour into it. From where is this story? Vigo. Vigo, written by Jeanette Bayo, whose family roots is the Caribbean, and who was born in New York. A Transnational, another one. It's a beautiful story with so much in it. It evokes contemporary issues crucial to our project, migration and transnational labor. Here, the migrant returns to the native home, Caribe, but is regarded as other by the taxi driver, even when the Caribbean can still be read on her own skin and heart. Then there's the evocation of the loved one in a more concrete jungle up in the north, the United States, working hard so that her, and here's the irony of it, so that her family can pay and return to that thrill of the exuberant native Caribbean. Now imagine, ironically, only from a tourist leaflet. So you, in your native home, you are now that tourist. Very poignant and very real and problematic transnational issues that will be covered in our story-making project. Okay, note that the last two stories written by Vigo students are not so much about Vigo, but about leaving it and the possibility of return. Because the writers, of course, are transnational themselves, and perhaps because, and it's something for us to think about, perhaps because of the history of emigration of Galicians to other parts of the world for economic and political reasons. And I've heard of these stories from Belen and from some of you. Or, here's another proposition. These stories of the Vigo students could be a mirror of the fact that Vigo is a coastal city. At the juncture of departures and arrivals, the self is always at the edge of voyaging out of itself towards other territories, and similarly receiving others from different territories. Vigo and Wollongong have a coastal imaginary. Now, I have here a series of questions for us to think about. Does this coastal imaginary, this capacity to imagine the self voyaging out towards and or receiving others, inspire us to be more open or closed to those who are different to us? Do we take on the fluidity of a water sensibility, more receptive to the inevitable commingling and ebb and flow of differences? Or, feeling vulnerable as a coast, do we, in fact, become more protective of our territory and its cultural identity? And with this coastal imaginary that is both local and global, have we developed ways of negotiating differences that can foster a more sustainable coexistence in a shared and shifting space? And can we, the way we tell stories, reveal the answers to these questions? And finally, can the inherently collaborative enterprise of telling stories together teach us new strategies for connecting with those who are different to us? Well, these are points of investigation which are at the heart of our collaborative research, which is a project between the University of Vigo, especially supported by Campus do Mar, and the University of Wollongong. Now, the project developed from this pilot Transnational Story Hub. Well, specifically, the research is a collaboration between me, a Filipino-Australian writer and academic, with a team of 8 story makers from Wollongong, and scholar and associate professor Belen Martin Lucas, with also a team of 8 story makers in Vigo. Now, both teams, mostly from that pilot story hub, have been working very hard with the first phase of the project, the sound recording of their respective cities, in order So this is the first phase of this project, in order to each create a collaborative 1-hour sound piece that will introduce their city to the other city. So imagining the city through sound. Okay, I will show you the project title and description, so you have more or less, okay, here. This is the project title and description. The Transnational Story, a creative coalition collaboration. This transnational project will investigate a collaborative approach to negotiating cultural differences. This approach will offer an alternative to the adversarial paradigm of relating, which has bred an intractable anxiety about difference and border negotiations locally and globally. In response to this urgent problem, the project will enable collaborative story-making between 2 regional and multicultural cities in 2 continents. Wollongong, Australia, and Vigo, Spain, will tell stories together in order to enable and develop collaborative strategies for negotiating differences and thus foster cultural interconnectedness. Story-making will start locally in the respective cities and develop globally between the cities. Thus, community strategies for negotiating cultural differences will inform the global transaction. The project is transnational. What do we mean? Well, in the big picture, story and story-making transit globally between Australia and Spain. But more importantly, our story transactions begin locally at regional level. It is a fact. Transnational negotiations happen in Vigo and Wollongong because of migration, emigration, multiculturalism, and globalization. We want to bring these regional stories into the national and transnational conversation. If you take, it's very interesting, if you take the word, look at the word, take a close look at the word transnational. The prefix trans, meaning in transit or in flux, is combined with national, which evokes a fixed and organized structure, the nation. But what's interesting is the prefix trans disrupts the idea of a fixed structure. Much like the way the ocean, in perpetual flux, often disrupts the state of the land, like in this dramatic image of Wollongong with its big waves. I'll show you. It's very much a surfing city. Okay, this one. Okay. That is very close to where I live. So this was the biggest swell, winter swell in 2007. A picture tells a story, and the taking of the picture tells another story. This photo was taken by Javier Leon Patino, a Peruvian student formerly studying at Wollongong University. So this picture taking, an act of storytelling, is in itself a transnational engagement at a regional level, where a Peruvian national negotiates with the local landscape of Wollongong. Now, this local global engagement disrupts the traditional concept of transnationalism. And this is exactly what we're attempting in our project. We are disrupting the concept of transnationalism as a transaction only between nations, the dominant hegemony. We are putting at the center of the table the story of transnationalism from the region, which, as we know, is often marginalized by the master narrative of the nation. And you know that fully well here in Galicia. And for the purpose of this study, we propose Aiwa Ong's definition of transnationality as the condition of cultural interconnectedness and mobility across space. Through collaborative story-making, both in Vigo and in Wollongong, and between these 2 cities, we will attempt to foster this cultural interconnectedness and the mobility of the imaginary, so it can dream up new stories with latitude in the local and global space. Well, such a transnational story-making will give local community stories as much cultural and political clout as the dominant stories of the nation. Also, this community story-making becomes an inroad into conceptual investigation. Now, here is my little pet term. I call it a grassroots theorizing, from the ground up. We always think of theory as something scholarly. But when you go, I'm so used to researching in the village, for my novels. I go to my old village, and you talk to older people. When they tell stories, it's philosophy. It's theory about life. It's grassroots theorizing that should be included in the conversation. It's from the ground up. So I'd like to think that with this community story making, that we have in this TSH, the Transnational Story Hub, this one becomes an important inroad into conceptual investigation, a grassroots theorizing where local communities think through the process of relating with the other locally, nationally, and globally. Thus, the local transaction becomes an active player in the national and transnational discourse. And hopefully, here is the big dream in the creation of social and cultural policy. At this point of my life, I always think when I write, when you do anything, you think just doesn't benefit you. It's a bigger picture. Can you influence social and cultural policy? So in this study, we propose a transnational imaginary that defies a fixed, singular, and dominant structure and narrow scope. Now, here is a wonderful definition of the transnational imaginary. Okay. Notice that it was written, it was from the book written in 1996, so early on they were already talking about this a long time ago. So let's look at that. Literary and cultural theorists Rob Wilson and Wimal Dissanayake argue that the transnational imaginary comprises the as yet unfigured horizon of contemporary cultural production by which national spaces or identities of political allegiance and economic regulation are being undone, and imagined communities of modernity are being reshaped, but at the macro-political global and micro-political cultural levels of everyday existence, unquote. Well, we saw the transnational imaginary at work in the stories of the Vigo students from the pilot story-making project. As they imagined themselves in relation to other communities outside of Vigo, their national identities were being undone and reshaped at the global and cultural levels of everyday existence, as yet unfigured, thus unterritorialized, unlike the nation. That transnational imaginary is a space of agency that facilitates the creative collaboration of diverse cultural identities, and thus the infinite imagining and reimagining of cultural products and culture itself. In the creative process of story making, I'd like to think that the transnational imaginary is a sensing space before it is constituted into a fixed sensibility, a fixed culture, a fixed story or discourse. It is disruptive, yet expansive. It has latitude, the freedom from narrowness. It is open to play between self and other. Now, here's the obvious question. Why are we doing this collaborative and transnational story-making project? Let me briefly explain the project's theoretical framework. I have here some quotes that will help me explain this. Okay, the quotes. Theoretical framework, okay. I'm sure many of you know this they're almost like famous lines here. So, take the word alterity, which means the state or quality of being other or different, a very simple dictionary definition. And if we take that definition, the difference between the self and its other underpins their respective identity formations. I am who I am because I am not like you. Now, this notion harks back to Hegel's dialectic. I like that line. Each consciousness pursues the death of the other. Nowadays, it's more than just the consciousness. Literally, you pursue the death of the other. With as we know, the global war and terror. Anyway, so this dialectic, this Hegelian dialectic, foregrounds a binary and adversarial relationship, which has been privileged to this day. In contemporary thought and engagement, we have privileged the conjunction versus. Also, self versus other has become synonymous with center versus margin. The self asserts itself as the center of story-making as opposed to its other, that is marginalized or, worse, subsumed into the center's narrative. So to survive, the other must then contest the universalizing impetus of this dominant hegemony. Thus, with this, setup, self and other are caught in a combative bind. Such fraught identity politics has produced an intractable anxiety of otherness. And with the shifting geopolitics since the 20th century, the macro-political engagement of otherness or difference has become deeply adversarial. The fear of the other. We have been, it's almost a line. The fear of the other, especially with the global war and terror, has now become a potent master narrative. But another philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, has a different take about alterity or otherness. His is an ethical and transcendent alterity. Let's look at that. The other precisely reveals himself in his alterity, not in a shock negating the I, but as the primordial phenomenon of gentleness. Okay. Equally relevant is another philosopher's argument. And he wrote a book. Have you come across this? George Steiner's, the book is Real Presences. It's such a beautifully written book. It's the philosophy of aesthetics. And there is one quote there that I love. There is language, there is art, because there is the other. Which means we have words, stories, music, paintings, plays, because the self wants to communicate and connect with the other, wants to bridge that difference. So cultural production is primarily motivated by our thinking of and accommodation of those who are unlike us. Steiner adds that this meeting between self and other must be approached with, this is another good quote, it's not there, quote, a courtesy or tact of heart, a tact of sensibility and of intellection, which are conjoined at their several roots, unquote. Now, our research project between Vigo and Wollongong is about investigating this meeting between self and other, hopefully with as much courtesy or tact of heart, to find out whether we can inspire a less adversarial mode of relating between self and other in cultural production like story-making. Whether this story-making, in this story-making, we can foster a cultural interconnectedness and mobility in the local global space. Whether we can imagine more the things that bind us rather than those that separate us as human beings in our shared planet. In this respect, we propose the concept of a creative collision collaboration. Collision collaboration is a reality that I have lived and practiced as a transnational. As a Filipino-Australian, originally from the Philippines, and I went to Australia in 1991 and lived there ever since. As a Filipino-Australian writer and performer, I have written and published novels, short stories, poetry, plays, and have also performed for stage and radio. And I always do it in 2 languages. Even if it's in English, in my head, it's 2 languages negotiating with each other. And in fact 3, because I have a native tongue, which is my local dialect. And I am also an academic and a scholar. So I live and work with multiple variables, constantly colliding and collaborating with each other. If they don't collaborate, I won't survive. So let's have a look at this definition, well, at least my take on this concept of collision collaboration. Okay. Between the body and the word, between different cultures, languages, or diverse art forms, there is a problematic borderline. When these unlike elements come together, some kind of collision, collaboration happens. Imagine two cars colliding. After the collision, the eye perceives the point of impact as an obvious gap, a fault line, a negative space. But from my experience, I have found that this space between the two colliding elements actually emerges as a third element, hybrid, ambivalent, constantly interrogating itself. So a collision collaboration is inevitable in the negotiation between different cultures, territories or identities, practices or persuasions. The border between them is a point of impact, often perceived as a fault line, a negative space. However, in this interstitial space, and of course I'm evoking Homi Bhabha here, in this interstitial space, new cultures and new stories of relating can emerge. Fraught as it is, the collision operates collaboratively. Together, different cultures create a new narrative. This is much like the new ecosystems created in nature's waters, where differences flow rather than collide into each other, as Aaron Korn writes in Forgetting Aborigines. And here's the next quote. I love this quote. The same moiety meeting of fresh and salt waters at this site, the guana, and the yellow foam, the jinkungun, that they produce represent the fruitful interaction of two similar and equal socio-political entities that do not assimilate each other and produce something new, entirely new, through their cooperation. Note the special focus on similarity and equality of entities, rather than difference or domination of the other entity. Our project aims to make a similar focus, to bring these equally valued similarities and connectivities central to the negotiation in order to deal constructively with anxiety about difference and the border. As we know, our world story is about collision collaboration, but global politics and even the media, some seem to have marginalized the collaboration part of the narrative, opting to privilege conflict, the collision, as the dominant and sometimes the only story. Our project aims to recover this marginalized or even abandoned half of the story, collaboration. Our collaborative story-making is facilitated in a creative laboratory, the Transnational Story Hub, which operates in the spirit of a space of flows. You might notice everything is so watery in this lecture, evoking agua all the time. I see, again, the water evocation, and I'd like to show you our space of flows in this project. And of course, I'm quoting a Spanish scholar here, courtesy of Belen. Spanish scholar Manuel Castells proposes the space of flows as, quote, the technological and organizational possibility of organizing the simultaneity of social practices without geographical contiguity, unquote. In our practice, the social practice of, in our project rather, the social practice of story making is facilitated and organized by the team of 8 here in Vigo and the team of 8 in Wollongong in their respective communities, and later between each other, despite the fact that they are geographically miles apart. This is our project's space of flows. Okay, let's have a look at this diagram. The traditional framework of alterity is self versus other, and versus, the border, are the privileged concepts. Now, in this border, where it happens, colliding, collaborating, where you negotiate alterity, we insert there the transnational imaginary, which is the capacity to imagine beyond borders to help this negotiation. In our project, this transnational imaginary coincides with our research methodology. If you can see here, this side, transdisciplinary research, in which post-colonial and cross-cultural theory collaborates with creative practice and community engagement, in fact. So this research has a dialogic methodology, creative arts in conversation with scholarship. Equally important is the fact that this story-making project is, as you can see, transcultural. And transcultural, transiting back and forth between multiple cultures of Vigo and Wollongong, thus the story-making is inevitably multilingual. The project is also transmedia, as you can see from that, because the story-making crosses mediums from community storytelling here, local community stories, and languages and storytelling modes colliding, collaborating with sound art, creative writing, involving poetry and prose fiction, the short story, and transmedia story-making, where we combine sound with text. So, all are facilitated by this Transnational Story Hub through a website, which is being designed, thank you very much, by Campus Doma. Now, through this website, Vigo and Wollongong imagine each other and their own selves, of course, and their relationship with each other through live and digital processes. So, local community storytelling collides and collaborates with globalized creative arts. This collaboration is rhizomatic. Okay. Let's have a look at that, the rhizome. I'm sure you've done Deleuze and Guattari in some of your theory classes, okay? The dictionary tells us that a rhizome is an underground root-like system, or an underground root-like stem bearing both roots and shoots. Philosopher and social theorist Deleuze and Guattari has this philosophical take on the rhizome. Quote, "A rhizome has no beginning or end. It is always in the middle, between things, interbeing, intermezzo. The rhizome is alliance, uniquely alliance. The fabric of the rhizome is the conjunction end, end, end." The rhizome, this interbeing, is in our project ever growing with roots and shoots, and new roots and shoots, and more new roots and shoots, and so on and so forth. So the focus is on the end. The rhizome is alliance rather than conflict, premised on adding on new growth. It is a constructive rethinking of the border. So I'd like to return to Castells now. If you need all these quotes later on, I can forward them to you. So I'd just like to go back to our space of flows. Okay, if you look at how we end. So, in the Transnational Story Hub, the story of alliance is the rhizome that grows in the border between the regional, coastal, and multicultural cities of Wollongong and Vigo across a local global space. But unlike Deleuze and Guattari, in our study's rhizomatic play, we recognize not just the collaborative conjunction and, but also the conflict-evoking versus. Realistically, in any transaction, we negotiate with both end and versus. Thus, our framework is less of terra firma, but more of agua, a space of flows. Self, as you can see there, self, and plus versus other. Okay, in continual flux, a collision collaboration, one that has latitude, a freedom from narrowness as it accommodates, as you can see in this diagram, accommodates multiple variables and negotiations that are continually in transit, like the water that continuously laps the shores of our respective cities, and even the air that we breathe. And the only variable that is fixed is that we are telling stories together. And as we include in this process our local stories and storytelling modes, we are still grounded in our cultural roots. But as the process crosses vast oceans and continents and nations and regions and grows multiple roots and shoots, from storytelling, sound art, to writing poetry, short stories, to digital storytelling in the web, the creative journey also continuously unsettles our story's roost. And thank God for this, because this unsettling of our cultural roost sustains the flight of the imagination, that capacity to dream up new stories of our coexistence in this planet, that dream of latitude. Well, I began this lecture with the sound of birds from Vigo and Wollongong. I would like to conclude also with birds, this time from another part of Spain, Granada, where I did a sound story on my favorite poet, Federico García Lorca, by recording the sounds of his city. The sound story was produced by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC Radio, with my wonderful producer, Jane Ullman. How did we create this story, this sound story? Well, I went to Granada in 2004. I love the city. And then I went around Granada and then interviewed and recorded Granadinos talking about Lorca and reading his poetry. Despite my broken Spanish, the people were wonderfully generous with their stories. But how I wished I spoke better Spanish and that I understood it better. One morning, in the village of Albayzin, has anyone been to Granada? Did you go to the village of Albayzin? The old Moorish quarter. So one early morning, I woke up to the sound of birds. And I thought, I understand this. A little insight about human understanding flashed in my head. My human coordinates in relation to this different landscape are in this sound. And on that morning, I just kept recording my waking thoughts, talking to my tape recorder impromptu. And from that recording in 2004 came this little piece of sound art produced by ABC Radio. It's a new story about understanding something shared, even if the language of the other is different. And such an understanding begins with listening, with utmost attention. And I like this, you know, if you read, Susan Sontag says that, if you're going to write, one of the important advice that she gives is pay attention. So it begins with listening, you know, with utmost attention to both self and other. Not to the obvious sounds, but to these sounds' deeper human nuances and implications through which we are able to see more in what we hear. Consider this. Perhaps the ear is the organ with the most capacity for latitude. So let's listen to this little excerpt from that sound piece excerpt of Corazón de Lorca. Now, I have to find it. This is it. Sorry, it has to be this. Can I? The birds like a prayer in the morning. The birds waking you up, telling you life goes on, like the tolling of the hourly bell. And voices on the periphery, voices I can barely understand. Gracias y lo siento for mangling your language. But we all understand the birds. We all understand the ticking of time in the throat of birds. Tomorrow I'm going to Biznar, where Lorca was executed.
Pero yo ya no soy yo, ni mi casa es ya mi casa. But I am no longer I, nor is my house now my house.
So, moitas gracias. That's the lecture. Thank you very much for having me. And I thought there's just a little thing that we'd like you to listen to again. We'd like to play a 3.40-minute sound piece in progress, very much in progress, on Vigo, based on the sound recordings of Vigo. And the script was written and produced by two members of the Vigo Transnational Story Hub team, Iria Misa and Jose Carrejal, with a technical production of Antonio Gomez Iglesias. It's just a context. As I said, the first phase of the hub is creating a sound story about Vigo, and in Wollongong they do the same thing, sound story. And the Vigo team have been recording sound stories and interviews of their Vigo community. And for the last 3 days, it was really intensive workshop that I've been here. We had this workshop developing some of these sounds into a sound script, and then going to studio for only 3 hours to produce the piece. So what you will hear is a very rough result of this workshop, very much a work in progress, our attempt to play with the medium of sound. Okay, here it is, Iria and Jose's mezcla.
Donde vivo yo es una zona tranquila de vida. Pues en casa tenemos nacimientos, algún tomate, los vecinos también tienen huerta, un poquito de huerta y animales. A veces se oyen por la mañana el gallo o los pájaros cuando se despiertan por ahí en los árboles. Y está un poco mezclado con la industria. A veces pues también hay cerca que pasan camiones y se mezcla un poquito todo, pero en el fondo es una zona muy tranquila.
Is almost over. Time for a little bite. Food for the body, fuel for the mind. In Vigo, it's time for Nella Fera.
Esta é a copia mais. Principiar a remaixa! E nós temos a mellor oferta da temporada.
Agora o saberemos. Vos, ilustre público,
Imos ter poesía que se pinta, poesía electrónica, poesía para comer, poesía para devorar. Ides quedar entupadiños, ides quedar fartas de poesía.
sin importarvos un carallo o que deixou escrito o seu inglés Julián Shakespeare.
Galician sounds echo in our minds.
Secuestra un niño con sus maus idioma e o aire xora entre as cores. O aire. Sen dúbida era o aire o protagonista daquela estampa. aire inflexible, interno, pillado infraganti, mentres lambía os beizos dos autómatas.
Okay, that's it. The piece is only 3.4 minutes, but you have evoked Vigo's tierra, agua, aire, gente y cultura. And there are some other members of the TSH team here from Vigo that have been recording busily throughout the past months. So, muitas gracias for this opportunity to share this project with you.